Jake Calloway never expected his quiet night to take such a strange turn. The man had seen his share of darkness. Years in the military had left him with ghosts he rarely spoke about, but none of that prepared him for the sound he heard that evening. It was faint at first, barely noticeable beneath the rustling of trees and the distant hum of the city. A whimper. Soft, weak, almost lost to the night. If not for the eerie stillness that followed, he might have ignored it altogether. He paused at the edge of his driveway, shifting the weight of the garbage bag slung over his shoulder. The street lights flickered dimly, casting long, uncertain shadows along the alleyway between houses. The sound came again, more desperate this time. Jake's instincts kicked in. He set the trash bag down and stepped cautiously toward the noise. His boots crunched against the gravel, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something foul. He rounded the corner, and that's when he saw it. A metal trash can, slightly dented, stood against the back fence. The lid had been knocked loose, and inside, huddled in a tight, trembling ball, was a tiny creature. At first glance, it looked like a puppy, a small, frail thing with short gray fur, curled up as if trying to make itself disappear. But something was wrong. Jake crouched beside the can, reaching in carefully. The creature flinched at his touch, its breathing rapid and shallow. He expected the usual signs of neglect, a matted coat, maybe ribs showing beneath thin skin, but as his fingers brushed over its body, he froze. The fur was too smooth, almost unnaturally soft, like silk that hadn't quite settled into the roughness of an animal's coat. More unsettling were the thin ridges along its spine, subtle but unmistakable beneath his fingertips. A low sigh escaped him. Someone had dumped it here, left it to die like garbage. His jaw clenched. He had seen this kind of cruelty before, people abandoning what they couldn't take responsibility for. But this felt different. "Easy, buddy," Jake murmured, his voice instinctively soft. The creature stirred slightly but didn't try to move away. Carefully, he lifted it from the trash can, cradling the trembling bundle in his hands. It barely weighed anything, its tiny ribs rising and falling with fragile breaths. Up close, he noticed something else. Its eyes were shut tight, not in sleep but as though they had never been opened at all. A wave of unease settled over him. Puppies open their eyes within 2 weeks. This one looked older, yet its eyelids remained sealed. The night air pressed against him, thick with unanswered questions. He glanced around, half expecting someone to step out of the shadows, to claim the abandoned thing, but the alley was empty. Whoever left it here was long gone. With a final glance at the shadows creeping along the alley's edge, Jake turned and carried the creature home. The small house at the end of Pinewood Lane wasn't much, just a modest single-story with weathered siding and a porch that creaked underfoot, but it was his. It had been his sanctuary since leaving the service, a place where he could exist without expectation. He rarely had visitors, and he preferred it that way. Tonight, though, he wasn't alone. Inside, he set the creature down on an old towel atop his kitchen counter. The overhead light buzzed softly, casting a warm glow over the room. He grabbed a bowl, filling it with water, then rummaged through the fridge for something soft enough for the animal to eat. Finding nothing suitable, he settled on a small dish of milk. The creature didn't move. It remained curled in its tight little ball, its breathing still unsteady. "Not a fighter, huh?" Jake muttered, pulling out a chair. He sat down, watching it carefully. After a few minutes, it stirred. Its tiny limbs stretched slightly before recoiling as though the movement had been too much. A faint sound, somewhere between a sigh and a hum, escaped its throat. Then, for the first time, it lifted its head. Jake's breath hitched. Something about its face sent a shiver through him. It was dog-like, yes, but subtly off. The snout was shorter, the ears slightly too rounded at the tip. And then there was its skin. Beneath the thin layer of fur, the texture looked almost too smooth, too uniform. The creature sniffed the air but made no move toward the water or milk. Jake exhaled, running a hand through his hair. He had rescued plenty of strays before, but this wasn't normal. It was weak, sure, but it didn't behave like any abandoned pup he'd ever seen. A soft knock at the front door startled him. His eyes flicked to the clock, nearly midnight. No one ever came by this late. Pushing back from the table, he stood, making his way to the door. He hesitated before opening it. The porch light flickered, revealing the silhouette of someone standing just beyond the glow. A woman, middle-aged, wrapped in a long coat. Her hands were buried deep in her pockets, her face partially obscured by the shadow of the porch beam. Jake frowned. "Can I help you?" Her gaze flicked past him, into the house. Then, in a low, measured voice, she asked, "Did you take it?" The hairs on the back of Jake's neck rose. "Take what?" he asked, playing dumb. The woman's lips pressed into a thin line. She exhaled sharply, taking a small step closer. "I know you found it," she said. "The animal." Jake's stomach tightened. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, rustling the leaves against the pavement. Then, just as suddenly as she'd arrived, the woman took a step back. "Be careful," she murmured. "It's not what you think." And with that, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. Jake stood frozen in the doorway, his pulse pounding in his ears. Inside, behind him, the creature let out a soft, almost human-like sigh. Jake stood at the doorway long after the woman had disappeared into the night. The way she had spoken, the quiet urgency in her voice, the way she had called it the animal instead of a puppy, set his nerves on edge. Slowly, he shut the door, locking it with an unconscious flick of his wrist. He turned back toward the kitchen, where the small creature still lay motionless on the towel. Its breathing had steadied, but it hadn't touched the milk or water. Jake exhaled and sat down across from it. "All right," he muttered. "What the hell are you?" The creature stirred at the sound of his voice. Its limbs trembled as it shifted, and then, for the first time, it made an effort to move. It raised its tiny head slightly, sniffing at the air. The movement was clumsy, uncertain, but it was trying. Jake reached out slowly, letting his fingers brush its side. The soft fur was still too smooth, the ridges along its spine still oddly defined. But beneath that, he could feel something else, a warmth that wasn't just body heat. It was almost pulsing. He pulled his hand away. His instincts screamed that something about this wasn't right. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. He glanced toward them, frowning. There was an unnatural weight to the silence beyond the glass. The woman's warning echoed in his mind. Be careful. It's not what you think. Jake shook his head. This was ridiculous. It was a puppy, malnourished, possibly injured, abandoned in the worst way imaginable. He'd take it to the vet in the morning, get some answers, and that would be the end of it. But as he reached for his phone to set an alarm, a sound stopped him. A wet, deliberate pop. His eyes snapped back to the creature. Its eyelids, sealed shut before, were now beginning to split. Jake's breath caught in his throat as the thin, almost translucent skin pulled apart, revealing something dark beneath. The process was slow, unnatural, like something being forced awake after years of dormancy. And then, its eyes opened. Jake expected brown, maybe blue, something familiar. Instead, two pools of liquid black stared back at him, vast and endless, like twin voids swallowing the light. The air in the room thickened. The creature blinked once, twice, then fixed its gaze directly on Jake. His chest tightened. He had faced down worse things in his life, enemies in the dead of night, the weight of death pressing against his back, but this was different. There was no fear in the creature's expression, no instinctive wariness of a human looming over it. There was only awareness. Jake swallowed. His fingers twitched at his side, fighting the urge to back away. The creature tilted its head slightly. Then, in a movement too fast for its weakened state, it uncurled from its defensive position. Its limbs stretched, too long, too slender for a normal puppy, and its small mouth parted. No sound came, but Jake felt it. A pressure against his skull, like a whisper without words, brushing against the edges of his thoughts. His pulse hammered. "No," he muttered under his breath. "That's not possible." The creature blinked, and the pressure intensified. Jake shot to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He needed air, needed to clear his head. But as he turned toward the door, movement outside stopped him. A shadow flitted across his window. Not the woman. Something taller, thinner, moving unnaturally, its limbs unfolding in a way that set every nerve in his body on edge. Jake's instincts roared to life. He grabbed the nearest thing within reach, a heavy flashlight, and stepped toward the window. The front porch light cast a dim glow across the yard, illuminating nothing but the empty street. But he knew something was there. Watching. Waiting. His grip tightened around the flashlight. Behind him, the creature made a sound soft, almost melodic. Like a hum. Jake turned back. The moment he did, his vision blurred, his mind folding in on itself like a wave crashing against unseen rocks. Images flickered across his thoughts, fractured, impossible things. A vast stretch of darkness. A towering figure standing at its center. Eyes like burning coals watching from the abyss. His breath came in ragged gasps. Then, just as quickly as it came, the sensation was gone. Jake staggered back, bracing himself against the counter. His heart pounded in his ears. The creature remained where it was, watching him. Waiting. And in that moment, Jake realized the truth. This wasn't a puppy. It had never been a puppy. And whatever had been looking for it outside, it wasn't alone. The world around Jake seemed to shrink, his breath coming in short, uneven gasps. The thing in front of him, small, fragile, yet undeniably wrong, stared at him with those abyssal eyes. His mind rebelled against what he was seeing, searching for any logical explanation, but there was none. And then it moved. Not like a normal puppy, not the hesitant, shaky steps of an injured animal. It slithered. Its limbs unfolded in a way that sent a visceral wave of discomfort through Jake's gut. For the first time in years, he felt truly unprepared. His instincts screamed at him to do something, run, fight, react. But before he could decide, something outside shifted. A low, vibrating hum seeped through the walls, almost imperceptible but enough to make the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. It wasn't a sound he could pinpoint. It wasn't natural. The creature on the towel turned its head sharply toward the window. Its body tensed. And then it spoke. Not in words. Not in any recognizable sound. A pulse, a wave of something unseen rippled through the room, pressing against Jake's skull like a silent scream. His vision darkened at the edges, his knees nearly buckling under the weight of it. And outside, the presence moved closer. Jake gritted his teeth, forcing himself to stay upright. His instincts roared against the unnatural paralysis gripping his limbs. He had to get out. He had to get this thing out of his house. The lights flickered. The kitchen clock stuttered, its hands trembling before freezing completely. And then, the front door handle twisted. Jake snapped into motion. He grabbed the creature. Not gently, not carefully, but with the sheer force of someone desperate to make sense of an impossible situation. It didn't resist, didn't struggle. It simply let itself be lifted. The door groaned as something pushed against it from the other side. A shadow, impossibly thin, too tall for any human, stretched along the hallway wall, distorted by the dim glow of the porch light. Jake had seen enough. Clutching the creature against his chest, he spun on his heel and bolted toward the back door. The air inside the house had grown thick, each breath like inhaling something liquid, heavy, wrong. His mind fought against the sensation, but his body moved on instinct. He shoved open the back door, stumbling onto the wooden steps. The cool night air rushed over him, sharp and biting, but there was no time to pause. He leaped down the steps, his boots hitting the grass as he sprinted toward his truck. Behind him, the house shuddered. Not from an explosion, not from an earthquake, but something else. A distortion. A shift. Jake didn't look back. He reached the truck, fumbling for his keys, his grip slick with sweat. The creature in his arms stirred, pressing closer to his chest. Then, the voice. Not the woman's voice. Not a voice at all. A presence. A command, though spoken without words. Give it back. Jake's vision swam. His fingers tightened around the keys. He forced himself to move, jamming them into the ignition. The engine roared to life. The shadows at the edge of his vision lurched forward. Jake slammed his foot on the gas. The truck's tires spun against the damp grass before catching, launching the vehicle forward. He barely registered the road as he turned onto the empty street, the town lights distant and cold in the night. He gripped the wheel, forcing himself to breathe. The weight in his lap shifted. He glanced down. The creature was staring at him. And for the first time, its gaze wasn't blank. There was something in those black eyes now. Not fear. Not aggression. But something far, far worse. Recognition. The truck barreled down the empty road, tires screeching as Jake pushed the accelerator to its limit. His knuckles were white against the steering wheel, his heart hammering in his chest. The weight in his lap, the thing that had once seemed like a helpless puppy, remained still, its unnatural eyes locked onto him. The air inside the truck felt wrong. Heavy. As if something unseen had crept into the space between them, pressing down on his chest like an invisible hand. Give it back. The voice, or rather the command, slithered through his mind again. But this time, it wasn't coming from behind him. It was coming from inside him. Jake's grip faltered for half a second, the truck veering slightly before he corrected it. He forced himself to focus on the road ahead, but his thoughts were spiraling. The rational part of his brain screamed that this was impossible, that he had to be hallucinating. But the deeper, instinctual part, the one that had saved his life more times than he could count, knew this was real. The town was still miles away. He wouldn't make it in time if whatever was behind him decided to catch up. He needed a plan. He risked a glance down at the creature. It was still watching him, but something had changed. The way it clutched at his jacket, the way its strange, black eyes seemed less alien now. It almost looked afraid. And then, bang! A force like a sledgehammer struck the back of the truck. The entire vehicle lurched forward, metal groaning under the impact. Jake fought to keep control, his heart slamming against his ribs. The rearview mirror showed nothing but darkness. Moving darkness, shifting like smoke, curling around the edges of reality itself. His breath hitched. They were right on top of him. With no other choice, he did the only thing he could. He turned. The truck skidded violently as he swerved off the road, tires kicking up dirt and gravel. He barely managed to keep from flipping as he plowed through the trees, branches scraping against the windshield like skeletal fingers. The forest swallowed them whole, the headlights cutting eerie beams through the dense underbrush. The presence behind him didn't slow. The shadows followed. Jake's pulse pounded in his ears. He needed to think, fast. He couldn't outrun this thing forever. He needed to end it. And then, the old bridge. His mind latched onto the memory like a lifeline. An old, abandoned steel bridge stretched across a deep gorge just a few miles ahead. It had collapsed years ago, leaving a gaping chasm where the road used to be. If he could lure them there. Jake pressed the gas harder, forcing the truck forward. The terrain grew rougher, the vehicle bouncing violently as it barreled toward the bridge's remains. The shadow behind him was growing, stretching, reaching for him. The gorge came into view. The road ended abruptly, giving way to a sheer drop into nothingness. The remains of the old bridge jutted out like broken ribs, rusted and useless. Jake had seconds. He yanked the wheel at the last possible moment. The truck spun sideways, skidding to a stop just feet from the edge. The momentum sent him crashing against the door, pain jolting through his ribs. The engine sputtered, the frame groaning under the sudden halt. But he didn't have time to register any of it, because the shadow had followed him. It surged forward, unable to stop itself in time. The inky black mass howled, if it could even be called a sound, as it careened over the edge, twisting and writhing like something alive. For a breathless moment, the world was still. Then, silence. Jake exhaled shakily, his fingers trembling as he looked down. The creature, the thing that wasn't a dog, was curled against his chest, its tiny body shaking. He stared at it, chest heaving. And in the depths of those alien eyes, he finally understood. It hadn't been the monster. It had been running from one. Jake swallowed hard, glancing back at the empty chasm. Whatever had been hunting it was gone, at least for now. Slowly, carefully, he reached down, placing a hand on the creature's head. It closed its eyes and leaned into his touch. Jake let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He didn't know what this thing was. He didn't know where it had come from. But he knew one thing for certain. It wasn't alone anymore.